The hands that grabbed Mabel Johnson's arm at exactly 11:47 a.m. on Sunday, March 17, 1946, belonged to a man whose white hood concealed his identity, but whose voice carried the distinctive Brooklyn accent of someone who had grown up far from the southern strongholds where the Ku Klux Klan traditionally operated, and whose presence inside Abyssinian Baptist Church on West 138th Street represented the kind of calculated provocation that the reorganizing post-war Klan hoped would terrorize Harlem's black community into accepting renewed white supremacist authority over neighborhoods that had achieved unprecedented economic and political autonomy during the 1940s. Mabel Johnson was 51 years old in March 1946, had lived in Harlem since 1919 when her parents sent 14-year-old Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson to live with her to escape the racial violence threatening their family in Charleston, South Carolina, and she had watched her younger brother transform from angry teenager into Harlem's most powerful criminal operator over the 27 years since his arrival, though she herself had maintained respectable life as schoolteacher, church deacon, and community organizer who carefully separated herself from Bumpy's illegal activities while accepting the protection and financial support his organization provided to family members whose legitimate endeavors he subsidized through complex money laundering operations that converted gambling profits into charitable donations and business investments. This documentary explores the violent resurgence of Ku Klux Klan activity in northern cities immediately following World War II, when returning white veterans brought racial resentments intensified by military service into urban environments where black economic advancement during the war years had challenged traditional racial hierarchies that white supremacist organizations sought to reimpose through terrorism targeting churches, businesses, and community leaders. While we present these events for historical understanding, we recognize that both the extrajudicial violence employed by criminal organizations and the systematic terrorism practiced by groups like the KKK perpetuated cycles of bloodshed that undermined democratic institutions and legal protections meant to govern civilized society. This content examines how the intersection of organized crime, power structures, and white supremacists' terrorism created volatile situations where communities dependent on criminal protection faced attacks from racist organizations that legitimate law enforcement either wouldn't or couldn't prevent, though we acknowledge the profound moral complexities and long-term social costs of relying on illegal power structures for community defense. Age-restricted for mature audiences studying organized crime history, civil rights struggles, and domestic terrorism. The 6 hooded men who entered Abyssinian Baptist Church during Sunday morning service represented a newly formed clavern of the Knights of the White Camelia, a KKK splinter group that had been recruiting in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx since January 1946 among white veterans who blamed black workers for taking factory jobs that returning soldiers expected to reclaim, and who viewed Harlem's thriving black-owned businesses and growing political influence as threats requiring organized response to restore what they considered natural racial order, where whites controlled economic opportunities and political power, while blacks accepted subordinate positions in service industries and manual labor. The group had conducted 3 previous operations in Harlem, including burning crosses outside prominent black-owned businesses, distributing threatening literature warning residents to know their place, unbething a numbers runner who had refused to surrender his route to white operators attempting to muscle into Harlem's gambling territories under protection of corrupt police officers who accepted bribes to ignore KKK activities while aggressively suppressing black criminal enterprises that competed with white-controlled operations. The decision to attack Mabel Johnson specifically, rather than targeting her brother Bumpy directly, reflected the KKK's calculation that striking at family members would prove more psychologically devastating than confronting criminal operators who expected violence and maintained security measures, making them difficult targets. And the choice of church as location for the kidnapping attempt demonstrated the Klan's strategy of desecrating sacred spaces to maximize terror and humiliation. Black communities, whose religious institutions served as organizational centers for both spiritual life and political activism, The intelligence that led the KKK to identify Mabel as Bumpy Johnson's sister had come from Detective Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, a corrupt NYPD officer who had been providing information to white criminal organizations about black operators in exchange for monthly payments totaling approximately $400, and who had specifically suggested that attacking Johnson's family might force him to accept subordinate position within organized crime, hierarchy that increasingly Italian mob families were attempting to impose on independent black operators who controlled valuable territories like Harlem's numbers racket. What the 6 KKK members and their police informant didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had received warning 3 days earlier from his own intelligence network that the Knights of the White Camelia were planning some kind of church-related operation, and that Johnson had deployed 17 of his most trusted enforcers to provide security at 3 different Harlem churches, including Abyssinian Baptist, where Mabel attended services every Sunday morning without fail, creating a situation where the KKK's intended terror attack would instead become catastrophic miscalculation, resulting in complete tactical failure, capture of all 6 perpetrators, and retaliation that would effectively destroy the Knights of the White Camelia's operations in New York City within 72 hours of the failed kidnapping. The intelligence had come from Teresa Chun, a Chinese-American woman who worked as secretary in Queens Courthouse and who had been providing information to Samuel Chun, Johnson's financial manager and distant relative, about various criminal activities she observed through access to police reports, court filings, and conversations she overheard between prosecutors and detectives who didn't realize she understood their significance. The 17 enforcers positioned throughout Abyssinian Baptist Church on March 17th included Big Mark Washington, who commanded Johnson's security operations, Raymond Quickdraw Carter, who managed tactical planning, and 15 other men who had been carefully selected for demonstrated loyalty, combat experience from military service during World War II, and willingness to use lethal force if necessary to protect Johnson's family and community members from racist attacks. The security team had arrived at church beginning at 8:30 a.m., 3 hours before regular service started at 10 a.m., and had positioned themselves at strategic locations including the main entrance, side exits, balcony overlooking the sanctuary, basement access points, and scattered throughout the pews and positions, allowing them to respond within seconds to any disturbance regardless of where in the building it occurred. Each man carried concealed weapons, including .45 caliber pistols, switchblade knives, and several had sawed-off shotguns hidden beneath their long coats, creating overwhelming firepower advantage that would become decisive during the confrontation that erupted when the 6 hooded KKK members attempted their kidnapping operation. The church service that morning followed the traditional format of Abyssinian Baptist's Sunday worship, including opening hymns, pastoral prayer, scripture readings, and sermon by Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr., who had led the church since 1908 and had built it into Harlem's most influential black religious institution with membership exceeding 14,000 people and political power sufficient to influence elections, negotiate with city officials, and provide organizational structure for community activism addressing housing discrimination, employment, inequality, police brutality, and other manifestations of systemic racism that pervaded New York City despite its reputation as relatively progressive. Compared to southern states where Jim Crow laws mandated explicit racial segregation, the congregation that morning numbered approximately 800 people, including many prominent Harlem residents, business owners, educators, and political activists who had made Abyssinian Baptist their spiritual home and organizational base for various community improvement projects that the church sponsored. Mabel Johnson sat in her customary seat 17 rows from the pulpit on the center-left aisle, positioned where she had worshipped every Sunday for 27 years since moving to Harlem, and surrounded by friends and neighbors who knew her as dedicated teacher at P89 Elementary School, where she had educated 3 generations of Harlem children while maintaining strict separation between her respectable professional life and her brother's criminal activities, despite everyone understanding that the substantial donations she made to church building funds and community charities came ultimately from Bumpy's gambling operations, even if laundered through legitimate businesses that disguised their illegal origins. The two women sitting directly beside Mabel were longtime friends who had no idea that 17 armed men scattered throughout the church were there specifically to protect her from threats that Bumpy's intelligence network had identified but that he hadn't disclosed to Mabel, because he preferred to maintain her genuine routine while providing invisible security rather than alarming her or forcing her to alter normal activities in ways that might signal to potential attackers that their plans had been compromised. The 6 KKK members entered the church at 11:43 a.m. during Reverend Powell's sermon about moral courage in facing injustice. Walking through the main entrance, wearing white robes and hoods that immediately identified them as Ku Klux Klan, despite the shocking audacity of appearing in full regalia inside a black church during Sunday service, surrounded by hundreds of people whose presence should have deterred any rational assessment of likely success for their kidnapping operation. The congregation's initial reaction was stunned silence, lasting approximately 11 seconds as people processed the surreal sight of hooded white supremacists standing in the church entrance, followed by rising alarm as the 6 men began walking down the center aisle toward the front of sanctuary, ignoring Reverend Powell's demands that they leave immediately, and making clear through their determined advance that they had come to conduct some specific operation rather than simply intimidate through threatening presence. If you've ever witnessed a moment when arrogant attackers discover too late that their intended victim possesses resources and protection far beyond what they assumed, subscribe and comment about times when predators became prey. Because what happened in the next 90 seconds would transform the KKK's terror operation into complete disaster that exposed their tactical incompetence and triggered retaliation, demonstrating that attacking Bumpy Johnson's family-activated response systems these white supremacists couldn't imagine and couldn't survive. The lead KKK member reached Mabel Johnson's pew at 11:44 a.m. and grabbed her arm while announcing in voice loud enough for surrounding rows to hear that she was coming with them as message to her criminal brother about who really controls this neighborhood, creating moment of maximum terror that he expected would paralyze the congregation through shock and fear, allowing the 6 men to complete their kidnapping and escape before anyone organized effective resistance. What happened instead was that Big Mark Washington, positioned 3 pews behind Mabel, immediately drew his .45 caliber pistol and shot the man holding Mabel's arm in his right shoulder, the gunshot echoing through the sanctuary and causing instant pandemonium as 800 congregants began screaming and scrambling for exits, while Big Mark and the other 16 security personnel converged on the 6 KKK members from multiple directions, creating crossfire. Situation that prevented the white supremacists from drawing whatever weapons they might have been carrying and forced them into defensive postures that left them completely vulnerable to Johnson's enforcers, who had tactical advantages of superior numbers, better positioning, element of surprise, and willingness to use immediate lethal force that the KKK members apparently hadn't anticipated facing inside what they assumed would be undefended church. Raymond Carter shot the second KKK member in his left leg, dropping him to the floor, where 2 of Johnson's men immediately pinned him down and disarmed him of the .38 revolver he had been reaching for when Carter's bullet struck, while 3 other security personnel tackled the remaining 4 Klansmen before they could retreat toward exits or successfully draw their own weapons, creating scene of organized violence that contrasted sharply with the panicked chaos of fleeing who were streaming out of the church through side doors and basement exits, while Johnson's security team efficiently subdued all 6 attackers within 73 seconds of the initial gunshot that had wounded the man who grabbed Mabel. The tactical efficiency demonstrated by Johnson's people reflected both their military training and their extensive experience conducting violent operations for Bumpy's criminal organization, and it stood in stark contrast to the KKK members' apparent assumption that simply wearing hoods and robes would intimidate black churchgoers into passive acceptance of kidnapping conducted in broad daylight inside one of Harlem's most prominent religious institutions. Mabel Johnson had remained seated throughout the 90-second confrontation, her stillness reflecting either shock or trust that her brother's protection would materialize as needed. And when Big Mark Washington approached her, after all, 6 attackers had been subdued, Asking if she was unharmed, she responded with calm dignity that impressed everyone who witnessed it, saying simply, "I'm fine, Mr. Washington. Thank you for your assistance," before gathering her belongings and walking toward the exit accompanied by two of Johnson's security personnel who would escort her home, while the rest of the team dealt with the captured Klansmen and coordinated cleanup of the scene before police arrived to investigate the shooting. The congregation members who had witnessed the confrontation would later describe Mabel's composed response as evidence of either extraordinary courage or deep faith that God and her brother would protect her from harm, and her refusal to show fear or disruption to her normal routine became part of the Johnson family legend, illustrating the strength that had sustained them through decades of navigating Harlem's violent criminal underworld while maintaining dignity and respectability. The immediate aftermath involved securing the 6 KKK members, treating the 2 men who had been shot, calling Bumpy Johnson to inform him that the anticipated attack had occurred and been successfully repelled, and preparing to transport the captured Klansmen to secure a location where they could be interrogated. Before Johnson decided their ultimate fate, Big Mark Washington contacted Johnson at 11:53 a.m. from payphone in church basement, reporting that Mabel was safe, that 6 KKK members had been captured with 2 wounded but not critically, and that the congregation had been evacuated without additional casualties, though several elderly church members had fallen during the panic, creating minor injuries that were being treated by people with first aid training. Johnson's response was characteristically controlled, instructing Washington to move the prisoners immediately to the warehouse on 132nd Street that the organization used for interrogations and other operations requiring privacy, and to ensure that any evidence of the gunfight, including shell casings and blood, was cleaned up before police arrived to investigate the disturbance that multiple calls to emergency services had reported. The interrogation of the 6 captured KKK members began at 1:17 p.m. Sunday afternoon in the windowless office of the 132nd Street warehouse, where Bumpy Johnson conducted the questioning personally rather than delegating to subordinates, reflecting both his rage at the attack on his sister and his recognition that the attempted kidnapping represented broader threat requiring systematic response that would deter future KKK operations in Harlem, while sending clear message to corrupt police officers like Patrick O'Malley, who had been providing intelligence to white supremacist organizations. The interrogation techniques Johnson employed combined physical intimidation with strategic manipulation, offering reduced consequences to whichever prisoner provided most complete information about the Knights of the White Camelia's membership, leadership structure, operational plans, police contacts, and funding sources, creating competition among the 6 men that quickly broke down whatever solidarity they might have felt before being captured and confronted with prospect of severe punishment for their failed terror operation. The intelligence gathered during 3 hours of interrogation revealed that the Knights of the White Camelia numbered approximately 47 active members, primarily recruited from Queens and Brooklyn, neighborhoods where white working-class veterans resented black economic advancement, that the group had been operating since January under leadership of Thomas Red Brennan, who owned construction company in Queens and used his business connections to raise funds supporting Klan activities, that Detective Patrick O'Malley and 2 other NYPD officers provided protection and intelligence in exchange for monthly payments totaling $1,200, and that the group planned additional operations including bombing a Harlem nightclub, attacking black-owned businesses with particular focus on numbers operations that competed with Italian mob interests, and possibly assassinating prominent civil rights activists whose political organizing threatened white political control of New York City. Government positions. This information provided Johnson with comprehensive understanding of the threat and specific targets for retaliation that would dismantle the entire organization rather than simply punishing the 6 men who had attempted to kidnap Mabel. Have you ever seen intelligence gathering transform defensive victory into offensive opportunity? Comment whether you'd prioritize immediate revenge or strategic dismantling of entire threat. Hits LIKE. If you recognize how professional interrogation extracts information that enables systematic rather than emotional response to attacks on family and community. The strategic challenge Johnson faced was deciding appropriate punishment for the 6 captured KKK members, while simultaneously planning broader campaign against the Knights of the White Camelia that would eliminate the organization's capacity to threaten Harlem without triggering law enforcement response that might disrupt Johnson's own criminal operations or create political problems for allies like Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., whose position depended partly on maintaining plausible deniability about his relationship with Harlem's most powerful criminal operator. The solution Johnson developed combined public humiliation of the 6 captured men with systematic targeting of the organization's leadership, funding sources, and police protection in ways that would destroy the Knights' operational capacity, while demonstrating to both white supremacist organizations and corrupt police officers that Harlem remained too dangerous for KKK activities, regardless of what political or law enforcement protection they might believe they possessed. The public humiliation, executed Monday morning, March 18th, involved stripping the 6 captured KKK members to their undergarments, painting the letters KKK in black paint across their chests and backs, and releasing them at dawn on busy intersection of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, where early morning commuters could witness their shame before they managed to find clothing or transportation away from Harlem. The deliberate choice to release them alive rather than killing them reflected Johnson's calculation that returning the men publicly humiliated would inflict greater psychological damage on the Knights of the White Camelia than simply having 6 members disappear, and that the spectacle of defeated Klansmen stumbling through Harlem in their underwear, marked with their own organizations' initials, would become story that spread throughout New York's criminal and political networks, demonstrating both Johnson's power and the KKK's. The 6 men were photographed by several of Johnson's people during their humiliating release, creating documentation that would be distributed to newspapers, political contacts, and rival criminal organizations as evidence of what happened to white supremacists who attempted operations in Harlem. The systematic campaign against the Knights of the White Camelia's leadership and infrastructure began Monday afternoon with coordinated strikes against 3 targets: Thomas Brennan's Queens Construction Company, Detective Patrick O'Malley's home in Brooklyn, and the meeting hall in Astoria, where the organization conducted its recruitment and planning sessions. The operation against Brennan's business involved arson that destroyed his office and damaged equipment valued at approximately $47,000, eliminating both his financial capacity to fund Klan activities and his legitimate business that provided cover for racist organizing. The strike against O'Malley's home stopped short of violence against the detective or his family, but involved extensive vandalism, including broken windows, spray-painted accusations of corruption across the exterior walls, and delivery of envelope containing photographs of O'Malley meeting with known KKK members, along with detailed financial records documenting the bribes he had received, creating evidence that internal affairs investigators could use if political pressure forced NYPD to investigate its officers' connections to white supremacist organizations. The raid on the Astoria meeting hall yielded membership lists, financial records, and operational plans that Johnson's intelligence team studied carefully before selectively leaking portions to journalists at the Amsterdam News and 2 federal investigators whose attention Johnson wanted to direct toward the Knights of the White Camelia's interstate recruitment efforts that might constitute federal violations, giving FBI jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute Klan activities that local police either ignored or actively supported. The strategic value of involving federal authorities reflected Johnson's understanding that while local NYPD officers could be corrupted or intimidated into ignoring KKK operations, FBI agents operating under J. Edgar Hoover's increasing focus on domestic terrorism posed more serious threat to white supremacist organizations, especially in political climate of late 1940s when American government was competing with Soviet Union for international legitimacy and couldn't afford domestic racial violence, undermining claims to be democratic society deserving global leadership. The interrogation transcripts and membership lists seized from the Astoria Hall identified 34 additional Knights of the White Camelia members beyond the 6 who had been captured at church and Johnson's organization spent Monday and Tuesday conducting surveillance and gathering intelligence about these individuals' employment, residential locations, daily routines, criminal vulnerabilities, and relationships that could be exploited to pressure them into abandoning their KKK affiliation. The intelligence revealed that most members were working-class whites employed in construction, transportation, manufacturing, and public services, including several NYPD officers, firefighters, and sanitation workers whose government positions theoretically prohibited them from affiliating with organizations like the KKK, but whose racism was tolerated or even quietly encouraged by supervisors who shared their white supremacist views or who simply didn't care enough about racial justice to enforce regulations prohibiting such affiliations. The campaign to systematically pressure Knights of the White Camelia members into withdrawing from the organization employed tactics calibrated to each individual's specific vulnerabilities rather than applying uniform approach across all targets. Construction workers faced economic pressure through Johnson's connections to building trades unions that could make them unemployable if they continued KKK affiliations. Public employees faced exposure to their superiors and the media. Small business owners faced various forms of interference with their operations, ranging from building code violations to labor problems to customer boycotts organized by Harlem community groups and individuals with criminal records or other compromising information faced threats of disclosure to authorities or employers unless they publicly renounced their Klan membership and provided information about remaining active members. These differentiated approaches reflected the sophistication of Johnson's organization and the intelligence capabilities that allowed him to identify and exploit weaknesses in ways that white supremacist groups with their cruder methods couldn't match or counter. By Wednesday, March 20th, 48 hours after the failed church attack, 19 of the 34 identified Knights of the White Camelia members had contacted Johnson's representatives requesting to negotiate terms for withdrawing from the organization, indicating both their fear of continued pressure and their recognition that the Klan couldn't protect them from the systematic campaign Johnson had initiated. The negotiations typically involved requiring the departing members to provide detailed information about remaining leadership, funding sources, police connections, and planned operations in exchange for Johnson's organization ceasing its pressure campaign and agreeing not to publicize information about their KKK affiliation that might damage their employment or family relationships. This intelligence-gathering aspect of the withdrawal negotiations proved nearly as valuable as the degradation of the Knights' membership numbers, because it allowed Johnson to continuously update his understanding of the organization's weakened state and to identify new targets for pressure until the group collapsed entirely under combined weight of external attacks and internal defense. Thomas Brennan attempted to rally remaining Knights of the White Camelia members through meeting Thursday, March 21st, where he called for retaliation against Johnson's organization and accused those who had withdrawn of cowardice and betrayal of white supremacist principles. But the meeting attracted only 8 people, down from typical attendance of 35, and even those 8 expressed doubt about continuing operations against Target, who had demonstrated both superior intelligence capabilities and willingness to systematically destroy everyone involved in attacking his interests. Brennan's speech about racial pride and white brotherhood fell flat among men who were facing economic ruin, criminal exposure, or physical danger if they continued their KKK affiliations, and the meeting ended with consensus that the Knights of the White Camelia should suspend operations indefinitely rather than risk further confrontation with Johnson's organization that had proven far more dangerous than they had anticipated when planning their church attack. The collapse of the Knights of the White Camelia had broader implications beyond the specific organization's destruction, sending message throughout New York's white supremacist networks that operating in Harlem involved risks that exceeded potential benefits, regardless of how deeply committed individuals were to racist ideology or how much support they received from corrupt police officers. The failure became cautionary tale discussed in KKK meetings throughout New York and New Jersey, illustrating both the tactical mistakes that the Knights had made and the effective response that Johnson had mounted, and serving as object lesson that deterred other Klan groups from attempting similar operations in neighborhoods where black criminal organizations possessed the resources and determination to retaliate systematically against white supremacist terrorism. If you were as systematic as Bumpy Johnson in transforming defensive crisis into strategic opportunity to permanently eliminate terrorist threat, hit like and subscribe, because what happened next would establish Johnson as not just Harlem's dominant criminal operator, but as community protector whose powers served broader purpose of defending black residents against racist violence that police either couldn't or wouldn't prevent. Detective Patrick O'Malley's career ended Monday evening, March 18th, when photographs of his meetings with KKK leadership and detailed financial records documenting his corruption were delivered simultaneously to NYPD Internal Affairs Bureau, New York Times investigative reporters, and federal prosecutors whose jurisdiction over interstate civil rights violations gave them authority to investigate police officers who conspired with organizations like the Ku Klux Klan to deprive citizens of constitutional protections. The evidence was so comprehensive and well documented that even YPD's notoriously corrupt leadership couldn't ignore or suppress the scandal, and O'Malley was suspended pending investigation within 24 hours of the materials being delivered. He ultimately resigned in April 1946 rather than face criminal prosecution that would have resulted from federal investigation into his KKK connections, and 2 other officers identified in the intelligence seized from the Astoria meeting hall also resigned or were transferred to positions where they couldn't provide protection to white supremacist organizations operating in black neighborhoods. The broader systemic impact of the Knights of the White Camelia's destruction included increased reluctance among corrupt police officers to collaborate with racist organizations whose operations might expose the officers to federal prosecution or public scandal, creating an environment where KKK groups lost some of the law enforcement protection that had previously allowed them to conduct violent operations with relative impunity. This shift didn't eliminate police corruption or racism within NYPD, but it did make officers more cautious about overtly affiliating with groups like the Klan, especially after federal civil rights legislation passed in later 1940s created additional legal mechanisms for prosecuting police officers who violated citizens' constitutional rights through collaboration with terrorist organizations. The long-term consequences of the March 1946 incident extended far beyond immediate destruction of one specific KKK group to reshape power dynamics in Harlem and establish precedents about community protection that influenced how both criminal organizations and civil rights activists thought about defending black neighborhoods against white supremacist violence. Johnson's successful defense of his sister and systematic dismantling of the Knights of the White Camelia demonstrated that black communities didn't have to passively accept terrorist attacks but could fight back effectively when they possessed organizational resources and leadership willing to take risks that institutions like police departments either wouldn't take or actively oppose through their own racism and corruption. However, the reliance on criminal power structures for community protection created profound moral complexities that deserved acknowledgement, even while recognizing the desperate circumstances that made such arrangements seem necessary or even desirable. Johnson's organization, while defending the community against KKK terrorism, simultaneously exploited that same community through illegal gambling operations that extracted wealth from predominantly poor, working-class residents who could least afford to lose money wagering on numbers, games that paid operators far more than they paid winners. The protection Johnson provided came with costs, including his expectation of deference to his authority, his willingness to use violence against rivals that sometimes endangered innocent people, and his contribution to normalizing criminal activity as a legitimate response to systemic failures, rather than fighting for reform of the institutions that should have been providing legal protection and equal justice. The institutional failures that created necessity for criminal protection systems included NYPD's pervasive racism and corruption that made police unwilling or unable to protect black communities from white supremacist violence, courts' systematic denial of equal justice to black victims of white violence, and political systems that excluded black residents from meaningful participation in governance decisions affecting their neighborhoods. These structural inequalities meant that legal channels for addressing grievances and seeking protection were largely closed to Harlem's residents, leaving them dependent on extralegal power structures that combined criminal exploitation with community defense in ways that complicated moral judgments about right and wrong, legal and illegal, oppression and resistance. The tragedy was that America's claim to be democratic society committed to equal rights was belied by realities of racial terrorism tolerated or encouraged by government institutions that should have been protecting all citizens, regardless of race. Subscribe for more stories about complex intersections of organized crime, racial justice, and community protection during periods when legal institutions failed to serve Black Americans. Tell us whether you've encountered situations where people had to choose between waiting for institutions to reform themselves or relying on imperfect alternatives that provided immediate protection despite their own problems and costs. Mabel Johnson never publicly discussed the incident at Abyssinian Baptist Church, maintaining the dignified privacy that had characterized her entire life, navigating between her respectable professional identity and her brother's criminal career. She continued teaching at PS 89 for another 14 years, until retiring in 1960, continued attending Sunday services at Abyssinian Baptist every week without fail, and continued accepting her brother's financial support while maintaining careful distance from his illegal activities, even as she understood that his power had protected her from kidnapping that might have ended very differently if Big Mark Washington and 16 other armed men hadn't been positioned throughout the church ready to intervene. Her silence about the incident reflected partly her innate dignity and privacy, partly her understanding that discussing it would draw unwanted attention to her brother's criminal activities, and partly her recognition that some things were better left unspoken within families where love and loyalty coexisted with profound moral disagreements about methods and means. The impact on Abyssinian Baptist Church included enhanced security measures that Reverend Powell implemented following the incident, including volunteer security teams trained by people with military or law enforcement backgrounds, improved coordination with police despite general distrust of NYPD, and emergency procedures for evacuating the building if threats materialized. The church also became more politically active in advocating for federal civil rights legislation that would provide legal mechanisms for protecting Black communities from white supremacist terrorism, recognizing that long-term solutions required institutional reform rather than relying on criminal organizations for protection. This political activism contributed to broader civil rights movement that would gain momentum through 1950s and 1960s, ultimately producing legal changes including Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 that provided some of the institutional protections that Johnson had provided through means in earlier decades. The story of how 6 KKK members attempted to kidnap Bumpy Johnson's sister from church, only to discover she wasn't alone, illustrates the complex power dynamics of Harlem, where criminal organizations provided protection that legitimate institutions refused to offer, where white supremacist terrorism encountered armed resistance from Black communities unwilling to accept victimization, and where the absence of equal justice under law created environments where extralegal violence became primary mechanism for defending dignity and safety. We present this history not to glorify criminal power or vigilante justice, but to document how systemic racism and institutional failures created desperate situations where communities depended on imperfect and morally compromised defenders because legal alternatives either didn't exist or served only white interests while abandoning Black citizens to fend for themselves against organized terrorist violence. The broader lesson remains that functioning democratic societies cannot sustain themselves when legal institutions fail to provide equal protection and equal justice to all citizens, regardless of race, and that when such failures persist, communities will develop alternative power structures to meet needs that legitimate institutions refuse to address. The challenge for American society was and remains creating systems that actually deliver on promises of equal rights and equal protection, rather than forcing communities into impossible choices between accepting victimization or relying on criminal organizations whose protection comes bundled with exploitation and violence that create their own forms of harm. The incident at Abyssinian Baptist Church in March 1946 represented microcosm of larger American struggles with race, power, justice, and the complex ways that oppressed communities resist their oppression using whatever resources they can access, even when those resources come from sources that would be unacceptable in truly just society. The 6 KKK members, who were released humiliated on 125th Street Monday morning, became cautionary tales within white supremacist networks, their failed operation discussed as example of how not to conduct racist terrorism in neighborhoods where intended victims possessed unexpected resources and determination to resist. Several of the 6 men moved away from New York within months of the incident, unable to tolerate the shame of their public humiliation and fearful that remaining in the area might provoke further retaliation from Johnson's organization or attacks from Harlem residents who recognized them as the Klansmen, who had been defeated and humiliated. Their departure from the city effectively ended whatever influence they might have had in racist organizing, though their ideological commitments probably remained unchanged even if their willingness to act on those beliefs had been substantially reduced by their catastrophic encounter with Bumpy Johnson's security apparatus. Thomas Brennan's construction business never recovered from the arson, attack, and financial pressure that Johnson's organization had applied, and he declared bankruptcy in August 1946 before moving to Pennsylvania, where he attempted to rebuild his life away from New York, where his reputation as failed KKK leader had made him unemployable in the tight-knit construction industry, where word spread quickly about people who couldn't be trusted to complete projects or maintain business relationships. The destruction of his economic base simultaneously eliminated his capacity to fund racist organizing and served as object lesson to other business owners who might have been considering supporting white supremacist groups, demonstrating that such affiliations could cost them everything if they targeted people with resources. To strike back systematically at their economic vulnerabilities, the federal investigation into the Knights of the White Camelia resulted in several indictments under newly strengthened civil rights statutes that made it federal crime to conspire to deprive citizens of constitutional protections based on race, though the prosecutions faced significant challenges given the difficulty of proving criminal intent and the reluctance of witnesses to testify against defendants who still had connections to local law enforcement and political figures sympathetic to white supremacy. The cases demonstrated both the potential of federal civil rights enforcement and the limitations that would persist, until later reforms provided stronger legal tools and more aggressive enforcement mechanisms for protecting Black Americans' civil rights against terrorist organizations like the KKK. Bumpy Johnson's reputation was enhanced, rather than damaged, by the incident, with many Harlem residents viewing his successful protection of his sister and systematic destruction of the Knights of the White Camelia as evidence that he genuinely cared about community safety, rather than simply exploiting the neighborhood for profit. This reputation for community protection served Johnson's interests by building loyalty and support that made his criminal operations easier to conduct, since residents trusted him more than they trusted police and were willing to cooperate with his organization in ways they wouldn't have if they viewed him as purely predatory criminal without concern for community welfare. The complex relationship between Johnson and Harlem's residents simultaneously, his victims through gambling operations and his beneficiaries through protection and philanthropy, illustrated the moral ambiguities that pervaded neighborhoods where systemic racism created vacuums that criminal organizations filled, partly through exploitation and partly through genuine, if self-interested, community service. The incident became part of Johnson family mythology, retold in various versions over subsequent decades as example of Bumpy's power, Mabel's courage, and the importance of family loyalty that characterized the Johnsons despite, or perhaps because of the dangerous criminal world that Bumpy inhabited. The story emphasized that no one could attack Johnson's family without facing overwhelming retaliation, that Mabel's dignity and composure under threat exemplified the strength that had sustained the family through decades of challenges, and that the Johnson organization would protect not just its criminal interests but also its members, loved ones, from any threat, regardless of source. This family narrative served both emotional and practical purposes, reinforcing bonds among family members, while also sending deterrent message to anyone who might consider targeting the Johnsons as leverage against Bumpy's operations. The legacy of the incident resonated through Harlem for years afterward, serving as reference point in discussions about community protection, racist terrorism, and the complex relationships between criminal organizations and the neighborhoods where they operated. When younger activists during the civil rights movement criticized reliance on figures like Johnson, older residents would sometimes reference the church incident as example of how Johnson had protected the community when no one else would, complicating narratives that portrayed criminal operators as purely negative influences without acknowledging the protection and resources they provided in contexts where legitimate institutions failed to serve black communities. This doesn't justify criminal exploitation or violence, but it does require acknowledging historical realities where people made difficult choices between imperfect options, rather than being able to rely on institutions that should have protected them but instead abandoned them to face terrorism alone. The documentary record of the incident remains fragmentary because neither organization nor the Knights of the White Camelia maintained detailed records of their operations, and because official police reports about the church shooting were either never filed or were subsequently destroyed to avoid creating evidence of NYPD's failure to prevent KKK attack on prominent Harlem church. The accounts that survive come primarily from oral histories collected decades later from people who were present at Abyssinian Baptist that Sunday morning, from newspaper coverage that was limited and often inaccurate, and from intelligence reports that various government agencies compiled about Johnson's organization and about KKK activities in New York during the 1940s. These fragmentary sources allow reconstruction of basic narrative but leave many details unclear or disputed, requiring cautious interpretation that acknowledges uncertainty while attempting to convey larger truths about power, race, violence, and justice during this turbulent period of American history.